We have just picked up sail, and have begun to move. 3 days ago, we may or may not have sighted the Acheron, who may or may not be looking for us. 2 days ago a midshipman, my midshipman, tortured out of his mind, brought his own life to an end, and now, a Minlet, who has crossed the line before, injures one of his crewmates for no apparent reason. I have far more to deal with than a wretch like Robert Young, Stephen. You may deal with him afterwards as you wish. I need him in my crew if we are to be fit to fight, and I am determined that we will be so. Ah, Lieutenant Pullings, he said, to the officer as he appeared in the doorway, looking between both Jack and Stephen. You are to inform Mr. Blakeney that it is duty to inform Young that he is to be flogged at X tomorrow for his behavior last night. Pullings saluted, acknowledging the order. And now, let that be the end of the matter. 88,888,888. Cicely pulled apart another strand of fiber, as she sat, knees bent with her back to the wall. Her mind could not stop thinking about Edward, how he'd gone, and how it was her fault for boarding the ship in search of him. God did want to punish her. He wanted her to suffer because of this. And he had his wish. Even now they had got their wind back, and the ship strained at its anchor. Her heart ached as she sat there, stinging and aching at the mere thought of her brother, at her own stayed hand, and why she hadn't ever told him. Edward had gone to his grave, thinking she was gone too, and would never know the difference. She had even told Blakeney the truth, when he had come that afternoon to inform her of the captain's orders, that she would be flogged for her attack on Nigel. Blakeney seemed taken aback that she was accepting her punishment so lightly, and he asked her why she had attacked a fellow shipmate. She'd replied that it was because he had murdered her brother. Blakeney had patted her on the shoulder and kindly but politely informed her that it could not have been Nigel, for he had been in the service of Aubrey for 3 years and prior, had never served on the Imperious. Cicely had patiently corrected him, saying that she had no brother called Henry Young, and how Edward was her brother, and she had come from England looking for him. She felt even more sorry for Blakeney when he broke with service protocol by informing her that he was sorry for her loss, and he had been the last person Edward had spoken to before he died, before adding that he had spoken of a sister, but no brother to them, and Cicely calmly told the boy that she had only become aware of his presence after he had gained his commission. She had then smiled slightly before looking away, and waited until she heard both doors close until she sobbed into her hands. 88,888,888. Mr. Blakeney, Stephen Matrin gestured towards the table as the young midshipman stood before them. May I be so bold as to ask you to reveal the information you gave me moments ago to the captain? The 13-year-old stood in Jack Aubrey's cabin, looking less than happy at the circumstances. He swallowed before speaking. If you please, sir, he said, glancing around the cabin, anywhere but at the Aubrey. This concerns Young. He looked back at Maturin, who smiled and nodded, reassuringly. I gave him the orders as you commanded, sir. And he took them with good grace. He revealed to me the reason for his actions, sir. Aubrey looked at Blakeney, raising his eyebrows. I see, he said, coughing slightly and glancing at Stephen before and giving the young man his full attention. What is his reason, Mr. Blakeney? Well, sir, he said, shifting from foot to foot, he told me it was because Nigel killed his brother, Edward Holden. Silence reigned in Jack's cabin for what seemed like eons. Finally Jack spoke. I see, he said, looking at Stephen, then back at Blakeney. This does indeed need close consideration. I do thank you for bringing this to my attention. Jack got out of his chair, and opened the heavy door at the latch, holding it open for him. That will be all, he said, dismissing the midshipman, and watching down the corridor as Blakeney went about his duties. I don't like this, Stephen, I don't like it at all, said Jack, frowning at his friend as he closed the door behind him. What would you have me do? I must punish Young, though I am sorry for his loss. However, there are no circumstances which arose to excuse last night. He will be lashed for his attack on a fellow. The doctor coughed slightly, before sitting down in the Queen Anne chair near the door. Jack knew what was coming. Maturin only did that when he felt there was room to negotiate. "You have a question, Stephen?" he prompted, leaning against his desk, looking at his friend as a prompt. "You need all of your men, am I correct?" Aubrey nodded. "And they need to be fit for battle?" "HHM," coughed Aubrey again, "indeed. And do not take this to mean I wish you not to flog Young, for that is indeed my wish. However, that is not my intent. What is your reason for it?" Jack stood up, stepping towards the large glazed windows in his quarters, and looking out on the ocean. "He has committed a crime, one of utmost seriousness. He has assaulted a man of similar rank. Whatever the reason, I cannot condone it." "I see," said Maturin, reasonably, shifting his weight forward in the chair. "In that case, I have a suggestion which means you gain what you need. Young will be able to withstand the blows of the lash." "He will be lashed, Stephen." Jack turned to his friend, arms folded. "Withstand the blows, so you still have another fighting man." "I have a responsibility to this ship, this crew, and His Majesty." "And you need all your men, I know that, Jack. Allow him to recover this. However he sustained them. You have another man to fight when you attack the Acheron, and then Young can be punished later." 88,888,888. "Is it true, Robert?" James's voice echoed in the sick berth as he stood over his friend. "Was Holm your brother?" He pushed. "Edward," she said, slowly. "He was." "Enough now," said the doctor, re-entering the berth and leaving the door open as he strode over to her. "Your friend must rest so he can regain his full strength." James glanced back at her before leaving, closing the door behind him before climbing to the top deck, where he met the waiting crew. "It true? Were he young?" James exhaled quickly, looking at the sailors around him, and swallowed before he spoke. "Yes," said James, nodding. He heard a gasp echo from the back and all around. He was Robert's brother. He glanced round the men. He sought him out. "Who wouldn't? I would, if he were my brother, however mean he were as an officer." "Harris, you shouldn't go speaking of the dead like that." As Bondon spoke, Nigel strode forward. His face didn't look as swollen as it had done a day ago, and James stepped back. Thus was the force with which he strode. He stared at James for a few moments, before looking in the direction of the sick berth. "Ah," he said, looking back to the men. "Is right enough. I reckon we all would have done the same for our kin. And I be saying this now and for all of those I hold nearest and dearest," he nodded round at the assembled men, "that though he deserves the whip, in the captain's book, he oughtn't get it." A cheer went up decks, in agreement. "I mean, he's such a weakling, he won't stand more than 2 at the most. Then what are we to do for our mizzen?" "Aye," went the cheer, all round from the crew before Calumet and the boatswain shooed them to work. 88,888,888. Cicely got out of the hammock, carefully and slowly that night. The doctor lay in his bed, sweating profusely from the bullet wound that had been inflicted on him that afternoon. She stared at the door, knowing that an officer would be posted there to prevent her from leaving, though she wondered what the point was, since there was nowhere for her to go. Not tonight could she see her brother. Not for her the shining light in his eyes, her only brother's eyes as his sister was brought back from the dead. Not for them both a new hope for the future. Only a cursed future, through her impetuosity. Cicely looked at the doctor, lying so peaceful, though she knew he wasn't. That afternoon she had heard him cry out as the men had lain him down on his own bunk, which they had brought down from his cabin. Saved again from discovery, she had thought. A bitter, ironic thought. Here the doctor was, having argued her case to the captain, or so an eavesdropping James had told her, wanting her to get better and having brought Blakeney in to tell him about Edward. Such care from a doctor for the crew, she had thought, as she watched his hands that afternoon, touch her arm, skillful, like an intricate carpenter, tearing her sleeve at the shoulder, bathing and treating the wound, watching his dark green eyes analyze and conclude a course of action in the same way Captain Aubrey would about the Surprise. As he worked, the doctor had spoken to her and reassured her as he stitched a cut on her forearm that the captain wanted her fighting fit, as if Aubrey's approval was what she sought. It was what all of the crew sought, another part of Hamid thought. Aubrey's men. Lucky Jack's salts. These were the ends of the earth, all right, and they were still unquestioningly following him. Cicely looked back at the doctor again, her decision racing through her mind, as it had been all afternoon whilst the men, Higgins, Blakeney and even the captain had come to the sick berth, despite the malodorous air to care for the doctor. She would fight, and it did make a difference that the captain wanted Robert Young. He had also added that the flogging would take place after the battle with the French ship, as if this was a sort of comfort. They would discover she was a woman then. Not that it should matter now, she thought, looking down at her own filthy, disheveled frame. The reason for her disguise, her Edward, was gone. Cicely stepped towards the doctor, looking at his face and torso, dripping with sweat, as he lay delirious, and her heart sank at his pitiful state. She wouldn't have been afraid to tell him that afternoon, after he had told her to strip to the waist for the examination of her back, for she felt completely at ease with him, and she could imagine him listening to her reasons too. A totally different manner than the captain. As it was, this had not been necessary. Blakeney had entered, all fired up with excitement about land ahead and fabulous sea creatures, and the doctor had gone above, returning like this. Cicely stepped towards the bed, leaning over it, and stretching out her hand. His forehead was blazing, and she withdrew her hand quickly. He needed cooling, she knew, or the fever he was suffering through the gunshot would worsen before anyone could do anything about it. Throwing off her shirt, she unpinned her bindings that held her breasts flat to her chest and uncoiled them, standing in the sick berth momentarily naked before slipping back on the dirt-ingrained shirt, and dampened the cotton strips in the ice-cold water that lay in a wooden bucket next to the bed. "There," she said softly, as the glistening sweat from his brow and face was absorbed by the cloth. "Much better. A bit closer to getting well," she added, wringing out the cotton in the water. She paused just as she was about to wipe his neck and chest on the second pass, looking at his face. Cicely had never been attracted to a man before, not romantically. She had hated and despised Benjamin Wigg, the man whom her father had intended she marry for the financial connections he would make. She also knew enough to be wise to men's amorous advances, and their true intent. Now, looking at the doctor, his dark hair cut into a fashionable widow's peak and sideburns, knowing his kind but firm nature, and his evidential intellect in matters medical, she knew if she were to fall in love, it would be with someone like him. "Someone like you," she said aloud, turning round the cotton fabric to a dry part. "Not Magistrate Wigg, with the 3 women in court circles. Not Magistrate Wigg who was reputedly with a harlot when his wife died in childbirth. I would far rather be flogged for an honest crime I'd committed aboard a navy ship than have spent the rest of my life with him." Cicely looked at the cloth, which she was about to wring out for the 3rd time, its filthy fibers staring back at her. "That won't do," she said, dropping it, and tearing 2 inches of fabric from what remained of her shirt, tying the rest in a knot. "There," she said, soaking it in the water again. She moved left arm which was covering the wound, and placed it on the sweat-soaked sheet. When Cicely saw the wound, she gasped. It was already beginning to fester, the skin round the wound was beginning to darken, where the blood supply was much reduced. "However would father believe I would fall in love with Wigg?" she thought, pressing lightly on the skin near the wound. She smoothed the water across. In the dim light, she saw him twitch and shudder under her touch. Cicely looked down, realizing she was pressing probably too hard. Not when there are men like you in this world that I could fall in love with. Cicely dropped her shirt end on the deck now, and looking back at the doctor. She leaned over him, and looked at his face again before bending over. Not when. She touched his forehead with her lips. I've fallen in love with you. Young. Cicely jerked up with a start, kicking over the bucket of water and catching her head on the lower slung beam. She landed on all fours, before finally getting to her feet. I was. She began, a tremble in her voice as she reverted back to the submissive Millard Robert Young. Get away! He shouted at her. What were you doing? He seemed so hot. She stopped, as William Blakeney looked between her and the doctor. You said you loved him. He said, putting down a second bucket next to the bed, kneeling beside Maturin, touching his hand softly. Please, Mr. Blakeney, she said, and he pulled his eyes away from the doctor sharply so as to chastise Robert Young for being so bold. You have been too kind on my part as to champion my cause to the captain, so I hear, as did the doctor. My love is for his charity, where I have none for my own indiscretions. There was a pause. You are not Edward Holham's brother, are you? Blakeney stood back up from the doctor and walked back round to face Cicely, who was now shaking slightly. Are you? Answer me, he demanded. She shook her head, buying it, before looking at the worn oak planks beneath her bare feet, and before the tears spilled onto them. She sank down near the door, head in her hands. Please tell me, he asked, in an altogether warmer tone, walking towards her and crouched down near her, placing his hand on her shoulder and patting it gently. She looked at him and saw, not her superior, but a young boy, looking at her with the kindness of a childish comfort. You are right, she said, coming down to his level and looking at the lad. I am not Edward's brother. Cicely looked at him, wondering whether this would suffice, and she saw the wind fill the sail of the boy's mind. He told us about you, said Blakeney, light glimmering in his eye and all trace of rank dissolving before them. Edward. When he was commissioned a middy 2 years ago. And he told us of you. How your hair was long and golden, and your eyes were blue. And how he wanted you to marry an honest man. He looked into her eyes, his own glimmering with comprehension, as he scanned her face. She pulled off the material covering her hair and it fell round her face, filthy and matted. Cicely Emma Holham, she said, sticking out her hand as an invitation for him to shake it. Pleased to meet you. Blakeney grinned. William Thomas Blakeney, a pleasure to meet you too. He grabbed her hand, shaking it, before suddenly dropping it as real life permeated their politeness, and he stepped back from her. But, he said frowning, you can't do that. You can't have been Robert Young for all these weeks. And rescued Fillings. And done all the work of a boy, as you asked, sir, she added, reminding William Blakeney of his station. Did he know? He said, looking over at Maturin. No, said Cicely. I don't know why I said it. A foolish dream of the girl who I'm not, she added softly. And please don't tell the captain, she added, looking back at the boy. But you're due to be flogged after the battle with the Acheron. The captain can't flog you, Miss Holham. Blakeney looked at her in horror. Why not? Because I'm a woman? I deserve it, she said, laughing lightly. Robert Young deserves it for avenging the murder of his brother, she added, but he'd rather fight tomorrow with the crew of the Surprise, against the frogs, Mr. Blakeney, on my behalf, to repay some of my debt of ill luck. Nigel didn't kill him, I did. She looked to the ceiling before back at Blakeney. I brought this bad luck to us all for being here, she said aloud, and if I hadn't come aboard, Edward would still be alive. That's what he said about his sister when he got your father's letter, said the boy. And Cicely Emma Holm told William Thomas Blakeney everything, from the moment she had knocked over the red pillar candle onto the oil-soaked books in the sitting room of her father's Gloucester home to the moments before she had walked across the sick berth and began to tend the doctor whom she had come to adore. Through it all, Will sat next to her, chipping in with details of Edward aboard, patting her arm reassuringly and touching her shoulder like a younger sibling as he listened intently, and often in horror at her sorry tale. "Miss Holm," he said eventually. "Cicely," she interrupted. William Blakeney looked at her in awe. "Miss Cicely, knowing what you've told me, I want to help you. Your family is far superior to mine, yet you chose to face such difficulties to find your brother. You're tough enough to fight, I can see. But when the captain finds out, and he will, he added, as she looked at him sharply, he will be very angry, especially as it is illegal for a woman to be aboard a naval ship whilst it is on a mission, even though unscrupulous captains do use them as powder monkeys and the like. The captain is so proud of never using women, and he's earned our respect." Cicely stood up, looking down on the young boy. "How old are you, Will?" she asked, looking kindly at him. 10? 11? "I'm 13, he said proudly, "and I've been with Captain Aubrey for 7 years. "Then you must understand I have to do this for Edward, and for myself. It's like when you told Edward that no matter how much your mother hated Captain Aubrey for taking her only child away from her." Blakeney looked at her aghast. "It's in the only letter I received from him," she added sheepishly. "He said you had to do it, to prove yourself. Like your care for the doctor." She looked across at Maturin, perspiration bespangling his brown again, and his chest rising and falling, labored and pained with the fever. Blakeney got to his feet, passing over to the doctor. "You love him too," she added, looking at Will, whose strong exterior was close to breaking as he looked at the man he held in such high esteem. He nodded, sniffing. Cicely held him close, giving him a much-needed motherly hug. "If he dies," sniffed Blakeney, "I don't know what I'll do." "He's teaching me to be a naturalist, you know," he said, looking up at Cicely. "The study of animals. He's already taught me the taxonomies, and I've learned about habitats and how to collect samples without damaging the land. He says I am a naturalist. If he dies." Cicely stroked the back of his head. "He's a remarkable man," she said, not to Will now but more to herself. Stepping away from the lad, she looked at his water bucket and cotton swabs. "He just needs our help to get over the worst of it." Cicely dipped the cotton swabs into the water, handing it to Blakeney, before grabbing her own bindings, and dampening them. Together, they soothed the doctor's fever as he moved unconsciously, working together for almost an hour. Will smiled briefly a couple of times as he took the cloths from Cicely, interspersed with worry on his forehead. Cicely stepped back, allowing him to finish, and the care and tenderness the young boy showed to Maturin was astonishing. "He's going to be all right." Will dropped his last cloth with a thump into the bucket, and looked at Cicely when he had finished. It wasn't a question. Timmins didn't intend this. He collected the cotton together, throwing it all in the bucket. "Now I suggest, young, that you return to your sick bed. You will need all your strength if you are to fight the enemy with your comrades tomorrow." 88,888,888. It was late afternoon, 9 days after Edward Holm's suicide. The captain of the Surprise had had his crew working double pairs for a week. This meant the 2 men that did identical shifts at different times of the day were doing both shifts, working alongside one another, thereby doubling each man's productivity. And fire. Reload. Double time. Master-at-arms. Get the front row and ear down. Jack Aubrey strode across the foredeck giving orders to his officers, who in turn managed the coordination of the attack plan. "Don't just stand there, Calumet. Move your men down." The young midshipman looked at his quarter of men, realizing his order hadn't been given loud enough. As I said, drop 2. Drop 2. He shouted, as they dropped down, and went behind the main body of the men, having practiced for the 8th time that day taking out the French front line. Cicely and James crouched down, scuttling with 6 other men low to the Oakham until they reached the back. The morning after Cicely had told Blakeney her secret, she had peered out of her bunk and had seen the boy had slept on the floor next to the bed of the doctor. He had said good morning to her before departing, and minutes later returning with 4 of the crew, Higgins and the doctor, who had taken him off the ship. Cicely had only moments to redress herself as young, binding her chest and slipping on her one-sleeved shirt before they'd arrived. That afternoon, she had been visited by Higgins herself, who had assessed her for fitness by his asking her how she was feeling, before summoning Pullings, who had her across the deck to the captain's quarters. Cicely had stood silently before the captain, who had said very little to her, other than she was to return to her duties, for they were to fight the Acheron, before waving her out of his sight. Before dismissing her, Aubrey had expressed regret for Robert Young's loss before stating that her punishment for brawling would be the lash, carried out following the battle. Following that exchange, she'd returned to the crew, who had stopped their work momentarily as she walked slowly on deck. She had looked towards Blakeney uneasily, and as Young's midshipman he had crossed over, showing her where she needed to work first. As she was about to bend to the deck, she saw a shadow cast on it, and she looked into the face of Joseph Nagel. He looked somewhat sheepish, an expression, Cicely decided, that didn't suit him, and he spoke briefly and succinctly in his Yorkshire manner, saying he was happy to see Cicely back, as the Mendic was a downright disgrace. And that was that. Cicely resumed her duties aboard, doing as Blakeney told her, though she had a slight suspicion he was not chiding her as often as he should have, and with the Salts treating her as ever they had done, as one of them. That afternoon the captain had made a speech to the whole crew, announced the double pairs, rousing the men to cheers and nationalistic pride, and the tide of euphoria had continued for a week, as the crew were shaped into the fighting force Aubrey required. And though she needed to be there, to do what she needed to do, the bitter biting agony, whether through unhealed injuries or her feeble form, was beginning to return, and she knew if ever she was to face the enemy without crumpling with the pain, she would have to take more drugs in order to combat the pain. And today, finally, after 3 hours of maneuvers, the captain called a halt to the proceedings, declaring that the day be won, and the crew should rest, as they would face the Acheron soon enough. Cicely watched the man evoke respect in his crew so easily on the quarter-deck, and she fixed her stare on him and on the tasks he was describing to stop her mind from looking at the now recovering doctor to his left. Laudanum, she thought, after slipping out onto the deck with her food. The food ration had improved greatly since they had anchored by these exotic islands, and Cicely suspected, as she tucked heartily into the meat, that she wouldn't recognize the animal it had come from. She noticed James heading her way, so slipped down onto the first deck, with her meal plate. Now was her chance, she thought, just one last sip to ease these aches. Then Robert Young could fight with the surprise against the enemy. Cicely crept down into the officer's deck, walking quietly across the planks to the doctor's cabin again. No light emanated from the door this time. She knew if he was not inside he would be dining with the captain. Carefully, she turned the handle, wincing as the door creaked open, before closing it behind her and putting her back against it. Early evening moonlight began to shine through the glazed window, and by the light, Cicely could just about feel her way through the cabin. She came across the trunk, opening the lid carefully, and took out the boxwood case which had contained the drug those weeks ago, and lifted the lid. A sip, just one drop on her lips, would dull her pain. "No," said a voice inside her mind, "you cannot take this. The battle will mean too many men will need it." Cicely closed the lid and returned the medicine box back to how she had found it before turning and kicking her toe on the table. As she shook her foot at the dull pain, her eye caught something which made her stop and stare at the fabulous illustrations, technical drawings and diagrams of animals from the Galapagos Islands, all carefully illustrated in the doctor's own handwriting. She stared them for a few moments more, picking up one, and then another, looking at the shapes of the strange and bizarre creatures and reading his descriptions of their appearance and habitat. Cicely looked harder. The doctor was indeed intelligent, for he had named these exotic creatures by the new Latin taxonomy, although Cicely was sure he must be the first to have seen them. Wonderful images of the exciting world just a quarter of a mile offshore filled her mind, where most of the Surprise's crew had been able to explore whilst she was still recovering. When the doctor had performed surgery on himself, or so the crew had each other the evening they had returned from Albemarle. A remarkable feat even if they had been in civilization. Her mind swayed, she looked at the other books on the table. One detailed insects of the South Americas, and though its pages were tidy, the doctor had made some of his own notes inside, cross-referencing to other pages with bookmarks and drawings. Then another book caught her eye. It lay almost hidden under a few unrolled pieces of parchment which would have gone unnoticed had she not been prying. The book had the title, Crustaceans and Invertebrates of the Mediterranean, and was written by Dr. Stephen F. Maturin, of the Royal Society. Cicely pulled it nearer, recognizing the significance of such a volume instantly. The Society must have been at least partially funding the doctor's work aboard ship, she thought as she opened the first page. In order for him to be able to travel to such places in the world to investigate such wonders. Only 1 or 2 commissions were granted a year, Cicely knew, and she marveled again at the man's talents. Sitting down at the table, Cicely held the book closer to the light, reading a couple of paragraphs, and looking at the illustrations. The doctor appeared to be describing an animal in Sicily whose habitat depended on volcanic extrusions for its survival, a groundbreaking suggestion. She flicked over a few more pages before her hand was stayed by a beautiful etching near the back of the book of Maturin himself holding a large egg. The description below it read, largest ostrich egg of the genus Reticulid discovered off the coast of Heard Island, by Dr. Maturin, January 1798. She flicked a few pages and swallowed as she read the corresponding paragraph to discover that he was the first to land with Goff in 1796 on the island. Cicely jerked her head towards the sound before getting to her feet quickly and dropping the book, cursing herself as Stephen Maturin entered his cabin, placing the yellow sheep-fat candle in its holder on the edge of the large table for reading the book so intently that she had forgotten herself. Bending to retrieve his book, he placed it back on his desk. Cicely stood up quickly and scuttled towards the door, before stopping and hanging her head automatically, as the doctor turned to address her. Your talents amaze even me, Maturin began as he looked across at his papers which Cicely had moved out of place. And I am not easily amazed. Guilt began to eat into her heart. She hadn't taken the laudanum, or even touched it. Why do you feel so wrong, then? She asked herself. Because of your vast overstepping of the mark by entering the doctor's quarters when you should be at decks with the men and looking through his possessions. She shifted from one foot to another, and her mind dwelt momentarily on Edward. It is unusual to say the least to find a lad of your age and rank literate. It's not as if the other men don't do it, another voice told her, they wait for the doctor in his quarters, right enough. But in the medical quarters, not his cabin, she reminded herself sharply. And I expect they are not after what I was. As well as being able to carry out your duties within the ship. For a Minlad, that is altogether remarkable, he continued warmly, smiling a little before grimacing as he adjusted his weight, leaning on his walking cane. Clearly the wound was healing enough, thought Cicely, that he was able to more or less carry out his medicine. And even more so that you were reading my own humble writings. Here. He held the volume towards her, and she looked at him, in pretense of ignorance. She began, then stopped, shaking her head. humble writings? This is society work. You were the first naturalist on Heard Island. Cicely bit her tongue before the words had a chance to tumble out. I can only read a little, sir, she whispered, hating herself for deferring to his superior status, both in rank and gender. I was looking at the pictures. Cicely shook her head. Maturin sighed heavily, as if a glimmer of pedagogic hope he'd been carrying had withered and died. I'm sorry, sir, she added. Sorry, young. He looked questioningly at her, and she dared a glance in his direction. Sorry to have to disturb you, sir, she clarified. And I'm sorry for your injury. The doctor looked at her. And I am sorry too, young, for your loss. Please, sit, he added, gesturing towards the small kickstool by the chair. Cicely glanced at him quickly before obeying automatically. If I may speak frankly, young, I do not believe Edward Holham was suited to life aboard ship. He knew his work well enough, but in these surroundings one must have a certain viewpoint on hierarchy to be successful. He looked at her carefully, his green eyes shimmering by the light of the candle as he spoke. Yes, thought Cicely. The rules must be obeyed. Everyone is your master or your slave. It's how it works. But it's not how Edward worked, and that's why he's gone. She looked back and their eyes met. It's not how you work, either. The loss of a loved one is very great indeed. Maturin let the comment hang in the air between them. A few moments passed before Cicely spoke. I failed my brother, Doctor, Cicely whispered quietly, trying to let the words come out sensibly and unchoked. I've searched for nearly 2 years to find him and tell him to leave the service. He is gone, sir, and I never told him that I was here to save him, so when we fight the enemy I am determined to redeem his honor. Battle is a terrifying place, young, as is a flogging. Are you not scared? God will be with me, sir. He will forgive Edward for his selfish sin, she thought, and my penance will earn his place in heaven. God? Maturin laughed, twisting a little in his chair towards her. Cicely looked up as he held his lower stomach, where she knew his wound had been. Don't you believe in God? Cicely looked at him in awe. I believe in him well enough, young. Now. He sighed, and got to his feet. Cicely watched him cross to the window, the flickering lights reflecting off the glass and the gold fibers in his evening jacket. All that religion brings is conflict, the results of which I have attended daily for several years of my life. But when I was shot, when I was close to the edge, I knew God was with me. He sent an angel to save me whom I saw standing near me, bending down, looking after me. Maturin turned to face her quickly, and his expression returned from frankness to reason. Even after all this science and reason, there is still room for God. He coughed. Well, young, he said, in an altogether firmer voice, and Cicely found herself getting to her feet. I find you in my cabin looking at my papers. Explain your presence, he continued sharply, frowning in her direction, a gesture at odds with his mild nature. I was looking for Mr. Blakeney, she said slowly, getting to her feet and looking down again. He said to find him if I was still in pain. At least that wasn't a lie, she told herself. Will had indeed told her to find him. Ha, so Mr. Blakeney is fancying himself as a doctor these days, then? He asked jovially, pacing round to the other side of the desk, eyeing the rest of the documents laid thereon. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and Midshipman Blakeney opened it. If you please, sir, you must, he began, then stopped when he saw Cicely. She looked at him urgently, before looking back down. Ah, Mr. Blakeney, said Maturin, looking at the boy. This man said he was looking for you, I am to understand, for he is in pain? Cicely could feel her neck inflame, as a blush brought on by the lie infiltrated. Yes, sir, said the midshipman. I told all of my men to report to me as you were recovering from your injury. I think he took my meaning literally. Cicely felt her heart relax as the boy's story explained her presence. Maturin smiled. Before sinking painfully, Cicely noticed into his chair. "Your consideration does you credit, Mr. Blakeney, a fine quality in an officer. What is troubling you? Your head still?" He looked at the desk for his large ledger of crew, and pulled it forward, flicking to the appropriate page. "As I thought. We didn't perform the full fitness examination when you boarded. We shall do this now." He looked at Blakeney. "Perhaps you wish to stay?" Cicely continued to stare at the floor, an action she had learned to stop herself from showing her reactions. "That would indeed be an advantage in my training," she heard Will say to her left. "However, I was sent to inform you of an accident upstairs. James Fillings," he added, and Cicely looked at him quickly. James? He was fine at supper, she thought. Dove was dropping the sail and the counterweight fell from the rig, continued Blakeney calmly, looking back at Cicely and informing her as well as the doctor. Fillings was on ropes, and it came down on him. He held the door open and the noise above infiltrated the lower deck. "Good Lord!" exclaimed Maturin, ignoring Cicely now and rushing out of the door that Blakeney had held open for him. Cicely tried to follow him, but Will stood in her way. It fell on his chest. "Cicely, you don't want to see," he said as Cicely tried to get past him. "Will, he's my best friend here," she said, looking at the young lad in the eye as he barred the doorway. "He won't make it," said Will slowly, trying to make her see reason. "The doctor'll just have to make him comfortable until the end." "No," shouted Cicely, "I have to be there for him. He has no one. Look, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do." She darted forward and picked up the young William Blakeney round the small of his back, swinging him out of her way, then making a run for it above decks. 88,888,888. An hour later she was in the sick berth. James's breathing was getting even worse now, more labored and ragged. The lamp in the room flickered as Maturin left, walking through the crew who were packed inside the small room, but Cicely didn't turn from James Fillings, his poor broken body lying in a low-slung hammock. She stroked the back of his hand lightly and brushed some of his blood-matted hair from his forehead. His injuries were far worse than she had imagined, and if it had been another man, Cicely probably would have thanked Will Blakeney for his consideration of her. She had become light-headed when she saw her friend, his right leg crushed with the force of the hundredweight, and his abdomen now concave. However, this hadn't stopped her from ignoring the doctor's request for all to move back, and though Pullings had prevented her from rushing forward. As his pair, however, she had been allowed to accompany James to the sick berth. And now he was lying there, perspiration soaking his greying shirt as they waited for the doctor to return. He had told those present that the boy would probably die from his injuries, however he would do all he could to prevent the pain. Before he left, the doctor had warned Pullings that he was probably going to have to amputate the leg, to give James the best chance of survival, and old Joe had nearly wept there and then. "He was such a brave lad, so brave," he said, as the doctor left, to the crew who remained in the berth as well as Cicely. "Done nothing to no one and look." "Don't be so down," said Chell, quickly. "He ain't done for yet. The doctor said he had a chance with an amputation. You know the doctor can fix anyone." "Aye," said a few men in unison, but the call was dull and hollow. "Come now, lad," continued Chell, tapping Cicely on the shoulder. "You've done what you can for your bear, right enough." Cicely got to her feet and turned to the men, stepping back with Chell as old Joe approached him. "You know, lad," he said quietly to James, "there's summat I've been meanin' to tell thee since ya mentioned your father. I recall a young man by the name of Fotherington who turned spy for the captain here." "Yes, we all know this tale, Joe," said Bondon, scornfully. But there's the bit I've been having trouble with since my dad was shot at by the Frenchies the months ago. Fotherington told us was married to a woman called Louisa Fillings, and was commissioned in Spain and had to leave his family. Cicely listened intently as old Joe told the tale again to James, that when he returned, having fought in Alexandria, Louisa had left their home through impoverishment, dying in a convent in Amra. When he heard his son was the cabin boy of the captain in the navy, he boarded the next ship, working wherever he could, vowing never to give up searching for his son. Cicely's heart glowed a little, knowing that John was still out there, looking for James, and that at least, when her friend pulled through, part of a family may at last be reunited. 88,888,888. I do not believe it. Stephen Maturin threw the boxwood chest at the cabin wall as he searched for the amber vial. Sir? Blakeney was standing in the doorway, looking in alarm as the ship's surgeon became more and more irate. He turned to the midshipman, and pointed towards his medicine chest. I never believed that I would agree with the captain that flogging a sailor was appropriate, but he has crossed the line. And I believed the lad was here because you sent him. Who? Asked Blakeney, daring to take a step into the cabin as the doctor slammed the bottle of laudanum onto the oak table. Young, that's who, here tonight. Tell me, Mr. Blakeney, did you send him here through illness? He stared at the lad, his anger bubbling under the surface. Blakeney shook his head, dumbly. The doctor pulled out a small packet of what looked like brown powder, throwing it onto the table. If I make it now, there will be just enough till we get back to England if we don't have the battle. I had more than enough here, and now Young has the audacity to come into my cabin and steal. But when will he be sorry for his actions, Mr. Blakeney? Can you tell me that? He has to have stolen medicine out of his friend's mouth for his own selfish needs. Sir, it wasn't . The doctor pushed the medicine chest out of the way before reaching underneath the table and extracting a large flask with an arm. In the darkness, the candle Blakeney was holding glinted off it. Mr. Blakeney, would you be kind enough to reach back under there and pull out my oil burner and spigot? They are at the back, and since my injury I can't bend low. I will, sir, but if you'll just let me explain . I gave him the benefit of the doubt before, through his weakness and injuries, but this is theft, clear and plain. I'll recommend to the captain at least 24 lashes to be carried out before the battle. Blakeney stopped stock still in the process of pulling out the equipment Maturin needed to distill more laudanum, and faced the doctor as he began to prepare the cannabin. Sir, she didn't take the medicine, I did. 88,888,888. What's all this about, Young? The doctor here claims that Mr. Blakeney believes you to be a woman. Can you shed light on this preposterous notion? Cicely looked amongst the faces of those assembled in Jack Aubrey's quarters as the mid-morning sun flashed its beams through the bays. That dawn, she had been awoken from her hammock by Pullings, who told her she was required by the captain immediately. She had asked why, and the lieutenant had told her informally just before they entered that this type of request came when one of the pair had died. Her heart had begun to pound. Thinking about James lying in the sick berth and guilt overcame her. If she hadn't been in the doctor's cabin last night, and she had been with him, perhaps she could have prevented it from happening. He would have been with her going to the Mindic instead of him on the quarter-deck. She had seen Blakeney first, standing by the captain's Queen Anne chair, and the doctor next to him, near the oak panelling. However, Cicely had not expected what the captain had said to her next, and she stood open-mouthed, gaping at the room. Speak up, Young, Aubrey insisted, or perhaps I will have the lash on you this morning rather than the morrow. Cicely. She turned her head to look at Will, who had spoken her name so softly. Why had he cause to tell the doctor? What was she to do now? Maturin cleared his throat. Mr. Blakeney informed me last night that it was he, not you, who had taken the last of the laudanum from my cabin. Furthermore, it was for my own benefit. However, I alleged you to be the thief, as I believed no other knew of its location. Cicely looked at the doctor, then back at Will. James, said Cicely. He's not dead? Blakeney shook his head. My complement of crew appears to be complete, young. However, I implore you to tell me of your own free will of your gender, in order for my battle plans to be put into place. Surely you wish to see the Frenchies at the bottom of the ocean, what? Cicely nodded. Then tell me, young. Did you inform Mr. Blakeney that you are, as it were, not a boy? And if you did not, are you in fact attempting to avail yourself of punishment? Cicely swallowed. Not at all, sir, for I deserve the punishment I await. I should not have attacked Joseph Nagel. However, it is true. I am Edward Holam's sister. A woman, she clarified, when Jack Aubrey's expression continued frozen. The words hung in the air for what seemed to Cicely like an eternity. The waves lapping mischievously around the edge of the ship were what filled the vacuous space where dialogue wasn't. In that case, said the captain, coughing slightly and striding to the other side of the desk. I will need to see this evidentially before I revoke the punishment, as requested by Mr. Blakeney. If you indeed are as you claim, a woman, he added, looking at her up and down, to which Cicely felt for the first time since she was 7 self-conscious, I cannot in all faith carry this out. But sir, began Cicely in protest. Carry this out as it negates the contract you, Miller, and I as your captain made. Jack folded his arms, glancing briefly at Pullings. I have done all that you have asked, continued Cicely, ignoring now the protocol of rank. You would not be fellowed to us, argued back Aubrey, unused to being argued with. I will take this punishment, she insisted, looking at the doctor. Hadn't she declared it openly to him last night? Didn't God know it? It was for Edward now that she was here, working in his stead, in his place as she could. You are a woman, Cicely, unsuited to life on a warship. It was the doctor speaking now, and the men and Cicely turned to look at him. I choose to be Robert Young. I will repay my brother's debt. She looked defiantly at the doctor now. He should understand. He must. Had I not allowed foolish emotion to rule, she continued, glancing at Blakeney. What else had he told the doctor? I would not have been discovered. However, when you would bare your shoulders, young Cicely. You would indeed declare it openly to the world, Maturin continued reasonably. And as it is illegal as well as and immoral for Captain Aubrey to allow you to work for him, that would be impossible. Enough, interjected Aubrey, determined to wrest control of the discussion. I need evidence before I can proceed. Turn to face the door and remove your tunic and shirt. Blakeney caught Maturin's shocked look. Jack, please. I need you to satisfy me of this fact before we proceed, continued Aubrey, folding his arms tighter, still staring at Cicely. Either way you are in a great deal of trouble. This is man o' war. We carry men for fighting for His Majesty, and as captain my word is law. Cicely looked back at the captain, but did not move. Mr. Pullings, kindly avail Young of his clothing, will you? The lieutenant saluted Aubrey, and took a step towards Cicely. She shot him a look of warning, and began to unbutton the dark red cotton tunic that was covering her shirt, before throwing it and her ragged one-sleeved shirt onto the floor. She stood before the captain, in her breeches that John Fotherington had encouraged her to buy almost 2 months ago in Sao Paulo, and the cotton bindings round her chest. Just as Cicely was about to undo these as well, the captain shook his head. Clearly he had enough evidence that Robert Young was indeed a woman. I came to rescue my brother, Captain Aubrey, but I failed. You are an intelligent man, sir. However, you must have seen that Edward was not suited to life in the service. Cicely bent to collect her clothes and began to redress. My brother told me that to work with Captain Jack Aubrey was the greatest honor a man could have bestowed on him, and he took his life because he was ashamed. Nevertheless, the law," interjected Aubrey, now lost for words. "Hang the law!" shouted Cicely. "I came to work on this ship as a minlet, and though lad I may not be, you are fighting this ship, full of enemy. I implore you, Captain, allow me to fight alongside my fellows. You cannot ask any of them to be spared on my account. And have I not proved myself as worthy as another Millard?" "No," said Aubrey, firmly. "You are a woman and as such you belong to your father." "No. You are his property, Miss Holam. I have no choice but to detain you in my cabin until the battle is over. I will not subject my men to the indignity of fighting with a woman. HMPH. Aubrey paced back round to the other side of his desk, and surveyed the horizon. Just then, there was a knock on the door. "Come." "Yes?" said Pullings, as all but the captain turned to see who was there. "What is it, Bondin?" "With respect, sir, we have come to ask Mr. Blakeney whether it were true." Barrett Bondin looked at his midshipman with questioning eyes before they settled on Cicely. "If what is true?" Pullings glanced towards the captain, who remained with his back to them all. "Speak up, man." "With respect, sir, have come to say that he has worked hard for us, and, begging your pardon, we don't think he's stolen anything.